We're talking about what the settlement agent does to complete settlement on behalf of a buyer. So once the transfer of land is signed, either by the client and properly witnessed and sent to the buyer's settlement agent, the buyer's settlement agent will keep a copy of it and send it off to the settlement agent. Now, in terms of the joint form of general conditions which go with the contract, the buyer's settlement agent has to send to the settlement agent for the seller the transfer of land and give them about 5 days to sign the transfer of land, because the seller might be in Cairns or even overseas. Unfortunately, with many settlement agents who don't have regard for other settlement agents, this sometimes happens that the buyer's settlement agent gets the transfer of land to the settlement agent the day before settlement, thereby delaying settlement. This is normally a problem because sometimes the seller's not available, but it's just lack of courtesy. But there's something I want to say here. If you are the seller, normally the transfer of land is drawn and prepared by a settlement agent. If you are going to be away as the seller at the date of settlement, you need to inform your settlement agent that you're going to be away at settlement, so that your settlement agent, the seller's settlement agent that is, can draw the transfer of land and get it signed by you. And normally diligent settlement agents or lawyers get 2 signed in case there's a problem, and send it to the buyer's settlement agent. Another way of doing this is giving a power of attorney which can be registered at Landgate to deal with the property on behalf of the seller. So the buyer's settlement agent has then sent the transfer of land off to the seller and starts following up with the buyer's bank or buyer's mortgage broker to find out if the mortgage documents are ready. Now, sometimes clients sit on mortgage documents or transfer of land documents. That's why we prefer to see the client so that we know the documents are signed and we're in control of it, because sometimes people don't worry about it and they think, oh, another day doesn't matter. In settlement transactions, time is of the essence. Every minute counts, because otherwise you could be landing up paying penalty interest. That's why we rather sign the documents with the clients and explain everything to them. So once the seller settlement agent gets the transfer of land, and we'll get to what the seller settlement agent does just now, the buyer's settlement agent keeps on phoning the buyer's bank to find out if they're ready for settlement. Now, when you sign the contract, you've signed settlement for a particular day. So let's say it's 21 days after finance approval and you signed your finance is approved today, the 7th of May. Settlement will be on the 28th of May. Now, there's something you need to understand which is really important, that the bank is not a party to the contract. So what happens is, if your bank's not ready on the 28th of May, as a settlement agent, unless you've told them I'm acting for you, they won't talk to me and I can't push them along. So, as I've always said in these videos, it's really important to choose your team properly. So I would suggest you choose a local bank, not an Eastern States bank, because some of the Eastern States banks only do settlements from a certain time in the afternoon, which limits your time. And you also want a bank that's going to cooperate with you and make sure that they are available for settlement on the due settlement date. Otherwise, it can put your whole life out, because you might have taken leave or you might be expecting family and the bank's not ready, which is a problem. And I draw the analogy of booking your car into a garage for a service. If you book the car in for a service or you book in for an operation, that's what's got to happen with the settlement. And I think it's really important when you obtain finance, you make sure that your bank will be ready, because otherwise people get hot-tempered and aggravated. So then what happens is, once the buyer's settlement agent has managed to book in the settlement, the buyer's settlement agent will then phone the seller's settlement agent and say, right, we booked the settlement at ABC Bank on Friday at 2 o'clock. Then what happens is that the seller's settlement agent will phone their bank and book them in at the buyer's bank, because settlement takes place at the buyer's bank or at Landgate in the city if the buyer's paying cash. So in essence, that is what the buyer's settlement agent does. In addition to that, after doing all searches and checking encumbrances and the buyer signing off on the pre-settlement inspection that they've been to the property and everything's hunky-dory, if there's a problem with the property, like for example there's a leaking tap or the roof's been leaking, sometimes that's just an insurance claim that the seller can lodge, but those are issues that are normally sorted out between the settlement agents. And the property, as I've said, has got to be in the state as it was when you saw it. Like for example, if there's a pot plant that you saw and it's missing, the seller has to bring that pot plant back. If, for example's sake, the hot water's not working, the seller's got to make sure it works. Now, before settlement, the seller's settlement agent would have checked the title and made sure that the mortgage is discharged. Now, if there are any other covenants or things on the title that have to come off, the seller's settlement agent has to do that. In some instances, the caveat just stays on or the covenant stays on. Now, while we're talking about caveats, let me explain to you what a caveat is. If someone lent the seller money and they didn't want to register a mortgage, because if there's a first mortgage in favor of the bank, it becomes quite cumbersome to register a second mortgage. So what they do is create a document called a caveat, which indicates a third party has an interest, or what's the word, a claim against the seller. And the seller can't sell the property without that caveat being removed. So what would happen is the person who lodged the caveat, which would be completely different to the bank or the seller or the buyer, would go to settlement, and at settlement, one of the checks that the seller's settlement agent would ask for would be in favor of the caveator. So in return for that, the caveator, or the person who lodged the caveat would get their check and lift the caveat, and it would come off the title. It's quite a complex area, and I think beyond the scope of this discussion, but it's just mentioned for the purposes of letting you know that when a settlement agent or solicitor does a settlement for you, it's a legal transaction, and there are certain things that they have to do which you might not understand or might not follow. And that is why I say, even though I talk about conflicts of interest in using one settlement agent, they're really good settlement agents who've been around for 30, 40 years. They know what they're doing. They don't take shortcuts. And I think it's really important that you as the client acknowledge, by paying a proper fee, stating that they've earned their fee. Before the buyer and seller settlement agent goes to settlement, they need to go onto the Landgate website and do what is called a check search, that there's no dealings on the certificate of title. Now, it might happen that the seller has taken a mortgage on the property a week before settlement, and the property can't go through because it's subject to dealings. This is something technical which doesn't really affect you as buyer or seller, but it's important if you do go and see your settlement agent and you want to know about it, to talk to them about it. So in a nutshell, that is what the buyer settlement agent does. Now, if you find this too difficult to comprehend, or you want to see this in print, if you go onto my website and you look under the SlideShare section of my website, you will see it's all set out in a PowerPoint presentation on the settlement process, as would be the content of most of these videos.